I'm so pleased to welcome Maury Klein to discuss his new book, A Call to Arms. The book chronicles the making of the American war machine during World War II, a true transformation of the country into an industrial giant, the likes of which had never been seen. Klein tells the story by focusing on issues like the role of women and the creation of new urban centers, and drawing portraits of some of the period's biggest players. The book is a valuable addition to the study of World War II because of both its comprehensive scope of the subject and the flowing narrative that makes it appealing to readers. Mr. Klein is Professor Emeritus at University of Rhode Island and is the author of many books, several of which are about the industrialization of the United States. Publishers Weekly writes that in his latest book, Klein is uncommonly perceptive, enjoyably readable, and authoritative. Please join me in welcoming Maury Klein.
You may have noticed that this book is kind of large. I'm waiting for the book was just published on Tuesday, and I'm waiting for the first reviewer that says something like, where some writers produce heart-stopping prose, Klein gives us door-stopping books. And it didn't start out that way, and I thought what I'd talk about a little bit is where this book came from, because if you look around, I'm going to try to get everybody in here, but you're testing my neck arthritis. When you look, there is no other book on the subject. I did not know this originally. I know why now. This book actually began as an idea of my editor, Peter Gannay, who's a really fine editor. And we had done a book together, a little book called Rainbow's End on the crash of 1929. And one day we're having lunch in New York, and Peter says he's had this idea for a long time that he's wanted to do a book on the mobilization process. And by that, he meant not just the story, but also what happened on the floor of the factory, what happened on the farm, and all of those sort of little things. So he asked me if I was interested, and I said, well, let me take a look. I went out, I did a bunch of reading, and I didn't see it. I didn't see what I could do with it. What I saw was the most obvious thing you see when you first get into it, which is the bureaucratic infighting among the agencies and the politicians. I went back to Peter and I said, I don't see it. I don't think I'm the one for this. And he said, okay. And we went on to do another book called The Power Makers on the history of steam and electricity. And I had a commitment to do yet another book. And when that was done, Peter asked my agent if I would again be interested in taking this project. Now, by this time, almost 10 years have passed. And I said, all right, let me look at it again. And the funny thing is, when I went back this time, I saw all sorts of things I didn't see the first time. And I'll tell you in a moment what the key to that was. So I said this time, okay, I'll try it. And I wrote a proposal he liked. We signed a contract. I got into the book. And as soon as I got into it for real, I saw exactly why nobody had done a book on this. From a writer's point of view, every book has to have a scaffolding, which is the structure on which you hang your story. You may think that the story has its own scaffolding, but when you have a book on a subject like this, where there are literally hundreds of different stories and themes, something has to organize them. And the first time around, I didn't see that. And I didn't see what the stuff was that it needed. The second time around, somewhere along the way, I came up with the idea that is really crucial to the whole book, which was digging deeply not into the usual manuscripts and some of the other sources, but into the magazines of the period. Because there are literally hundreds of stories of individual people, and the magazines of that period were very well written. Unfortunately, we don't know who a lot of the writers were because they're not bylined, but you can find stories on almost everything. And by magazines, I'm talking about Time, Life, Newsweek, Saturday Evening Post, Fortune, Look, Life, and some more specialized ones. And I just found a fabulous amount of stuff in there and some wonderful stories, which you'll find in the book. If you look through the footnotes to the book, you'll see how many of those footnotes refer to the magazines. So they became, in a curious way, the scaffolding. They became the figures, the points from which this stuff got organized. I'd love to describe to you how I did it, but I don't know how I did it. One of the things about being a writer, and it's not like this is a new experience in my 17th book, but I still can't tell you how I got from chapter 23 to 24, or chapter 2 to 3, or when I start chapter 3, what is going to be in it exactly. I know what it's going to cover, but I don't know what's going to be in it. And yet, I should point out that when we signed the contract, it was for the usual, like 200,000 word book, because editors and publishers get very nervous when you start getting big for financial reasons. And I didn't bother telling Peter this. And I really, once I saw how big this beast was becoming, I really hesitated to tell him, because he knew me well enough. I didn't have to send him chapters as I went along so that he could see it. I waited till I had a clump to send him. And one of the great things about Peter is that when he started reading this and saw it, he understood why it had to be this long. And he had the courage to take it to his bosses and say, we have to make this literally a big book. Because the subject is that, and the subject demands it. And he stuck by it. And I don't think I've ever been as happy as the moment when I got the message from him to that effect, as opposed to the one I expected, which is, no, we're going to have to cut about a third of this, at least. At least. So that's the genesis of the book. Now, before we ask some questions, or I invite some questions, let me just make a couple of points about this period, because they're easily overlooked. One of the most important, if not the most important thing to understanding what happened during these years is that this is really two very different periods. The period between September of 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, and the firing on Pearl Harbor. During that period, we're not actually in the war. And it's very difficult for Franklin Roosevelt and those who understand the perils and the threat that Hitler poses to convince the American people that we need to do something, for reasons I'll come to. The second and important period is, of course, from Pearl Harbor to the end. At that point, we are in it. The focus changes. A lot of what had been fighting and conflict goes away. The second important point here is that this is often portrayed as a process by which Americans stood shoulder to shoulder and marched arm in arm and went forward like true patriots and got it all done. History never works that way. Never works that way. And in fact, one of the things I go after in the book is I don't really like what I call the greatest generation myth. Because what that does is that it papers over what really happened, which is everything from the greatest of patriots to the worst of people. But the important point here is that during that preparedness period up to Pearl Harbor, there is so much fighting and bickering and disagreement that hardly anything that needed to be done got done. And what got done in spite of that. The wonder is that it got done. And there are good reasons for this. I don't mean to say that people were just bad, not at all. A lot of this has to do with the legacy of World War I and the American attitude towards it, and towards munitions makers, and towards the military, and towards anything having to do with weapons production. And one of the legacies there, and this is especially important for businesses, one of the legacies there is that corporations at the end of the war, when World War I ended, a lot of companies had built new factories to produce nothing but armaments. And by the end of the war, even though a lot of our stuff didn't actually get into World War I, by the end of the war, we had the largest munitions industry in the world. Then the government started canceling contracts. And when they started canceling contracts, that meant that these guys were stuck with factories and plants that had no purpose, that they had just built. to say nothing of a lot of employees who were about to be discharged just like that. They asked the government, at least give us some kind of tax break so that, we can carry these buildings in some way and do something with them, just in case they're needed again. Government wouldn't do it. So a lot of the companies, and I mean a lot of the companies, basically said, to hell with this, and they tore the factories down. And within a few years, the U.S. went from the biggest armament industry in the world to almost no armament industry. So when World War II began, we could not have been in worse shape in every aspect. And I won't go into all of that because then you won't read the book. But that is essentially one of the most important things, is that there were so many things that were a legacy, and they're recounted in the book, of World War I. I don't know how we managed to do it, in a sense. But what we did is phenomenal. You will find in the book a sort of pivotal chapter, I think it's around 23 or thereabouts, called Weapons of Mass Production. And the point of that chapter is that we did not have the best weapons in the world. Sometimes we didn't even have very good weapons. But we literally buried the Axis in weapons. And that was the object. All along, that was the object. American manufacturers understood that you didn't have to have a weapon that was 100% perfect. It could be 90% perfect, especially if you had 5 times as many of them as the enemy had. Mass production was the key to this process. This is the first really mechanized war. To some extent, World War I is, but not on the scale of this war. And mass production was invented by Americans, and invented by Americans in the auto industry. So who in a mechanized war is in the best shape to mass produce mechanized goods? And who understands the process? The Germans several German officials realized this. Albert Speer is a good example. They realized that their industrial organization and philosophy was hopelessly obsolete for this situation. You talk about the Blitzkrieg, but what you may not know is that during the Blitzkrieg in 1939 and even later, the Germans were still using an awful lot of horses to move things. And as a result of that, Speer and others understood that if they didn't change the way, they were basically craftsmen. They liked to create an absolutely super weapon, and they did. They created some fabulous weapons. They created tanks that could literally run all over our tanks. But we had so many more of them, it didn't matter. And you'll find in the book a touching example of all of this at D-Day, where I quote something that I ran across that Ernie Pyle had said when he walked on the beach the day after. It is the philosophy that if you bury the enemy, he cannot win. And that was the whole idea of our production. And the facts and figures, the numbers of things that we produced are in there. Once we got cranked up to produce, what most people don't understand about mass production, because people would come up to the auto people, for example, and say, well, look, you can turn out 1,000 cars and just like this, why can't you turn out 1,000 tanks? To which the auto guys would reply, because a tank ain't a car and is nothing like it. Doesn't have the same motor, doesn't have the same parts. And by the way, no Americans had ever really made a tank before. It was very funny because when they started producing light tanks, they called up the head of Chrysler, K.T. Keller, and they asked him, can you make a tank for us? He said, I don't see why not. What's a tank? So Keller and his engineers went over to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, where they had an actual bona fide tank, which was already obsolete, by the way. And the engineers did what you do in mass production. They took the entire tank apart, piece by piece. They laid it out. They made drawings and blueprints of every part, and they left it for the local engineers to put back together. And then they went back and figured out, how do you tool this? How do you set it up? How do you produce it? And so forth. In other words, they just started from scratch. Same thing happened in the aircraft industry. Same thing happened in shipbuilding. And the people who were often most successful, particularly in shipbuilding, were people who'd never built ships. So they didn't start with a handicap of, well, this is how we've always done it. And how we've always done it wasn't going to work. Because basically in 1939 and 40, the shipbuilding industry and the aircraft industry, which were two of the absolutely crucial ones, both of them were basically boutique industries, by which I mean you build them one at a time, because they didn't know about mass production or how to do it. And it took them a good while to figure it out. That's why when Franklin Roosevelt asked for 50,000 planes, they all sort of dropped their teeth, because that was just absurd. It was absolutely absurd. Roosevelt knew that, but he knew by saying it, he would goad them into doing it, which was really one of his purposes. So this is basically the story of how you go from all of these handicaps and conflict to finally reaching a point where the full productive might of the American economy, which dwarfs every other economy, is finally utilized. And that did not happen really until 1943. That's when the productive tide began to turn. And that, by the way, is why the military tide begins to turn in 1943. One last point, and then I'll ask for questions. Whatever you think about the oil industry, and we all have some thoughts about the oil industry, I'm sure, they were the absolutely crucial industry in this war, because a mechanized war, nothing, and I mean nothing, runs without oil or products of the oil industry. And they had a fiendishly difficult job to do, even though we were the world's largest producer of oil. That largest producer didn't translate into the kinds of specific products that were needed. One of which I'll just mention, and you can read its story, but it's what won the Battle of Britain for the British, who got it from us, got the oil from us, 100-octane gasoline. Why is that important? Because you use that in airplanes. It lets a plane take off in a shorter distance, go a higher speed, maneuver better, carry a heavy armament. That's how the RAF was able to beat the superior German numbers, because the Germans had nothing like it. Germany doesn't have an oil industry. That was one of its biggest weaknesses. And the other crucial product in World War II is rubber. Rubber is made from oil byproducts. So every time you keep coming back to this. And Germany had only a synthetic rubber. They couldn't make rubber either. We had no rubber industry. And because of all of the infighting that I mentioned, for the first 2-3 years prior to Pearl Harbor, we didn't start on a synthetic rubber industry. And Roosevelt was strangely obtuse on this. He kept saying, well, let those rich rubber companies do it on their own. He never quite realized what was going to happen if we went to war with Japan. Our entire rubber supply, literally, is cut off. And you don't just grow rubber trees overnight. Even if we could grow rubber trees in this country, which the attempts failed, it takes 7 years for them to mature. I don't think we could have waited. So that's just a little preview. I'd welcome any questions or specifics that you have.
What I'm wondering is, knowing that the Germans were cranking up for a war, that would have been obvious. You'd had to have been blind not to know that. And that the Japanese were doing the same thing. They probably took some islands before much of anything happened, because they wanted to, occupy them. But what I'm wondering is, did we make any preparations? Did we design something like a decent torpedo, like an interceptor aircraft? Was there anything on the design table? When did our super fortress get designed? I mean, we had to have some preparation. Didn't we have any ideas along that line?
There were some. We had a few superior weapons. The B-17 bomber was already through 2 or 3, maybe even 4 versions. The P-38 was on the drawing board. A couple of other planes. No tanks, no artillery, no I can't stress to you how pitiful the American military was in 1939-40. I think we were, 28th in the world. And you don't want to know who we were behind. There was the annual military maneuvers that the Army had one year, I think it was 1940, and they went out and they did their stuff. There wasn't much stuff. There was hardly any armor. No paratroops because they didn't exist yet. There was no real fighting. A lot of the troops didn't even have weapons yet because there weren't enough weapons. And Time had a wonderful comment on all of this, that they looked like they could have been beaten by an energetic group of Boy Scouts. Another, yes, sir, over here.
Can you give us a sense of how significant a role U.S. manufactured and supplied weapons played in the Soviet war effort on the Eastern Front?
Once we were finally delivering them, and Roosevelt had to push and prod for that, they played a significant Lend-Lease, which is, again, a really radical piece of legislation. They said at the time, and it was pretty much true, that it gave the president more power than any president had ever held before. And one of the reasons for that was he wanted to push weapons out. Once Harry Hopkins had gone to Moscow and had literally asked Stalin, what do you need? And taken his measure and come back and said, I think we should do this. And the reason we should do this is the obvious one that isolationists at home couldn't get, which is every German that the Russians kill is one we don't have to deal with. Every tank they blow up is one we don't have to deal with. And once the flow began, and the flow has to go through several obstacles, political opposition at home from all sorts of groups, manufacturing, because now if you build this plane, some people are saying it ought to be our plane. We say, no, they need it more than we do right now. So you have to go through that political process. And then thirdly, the logistics. How do you get the stuff there at a time when the German submarines are ruling the seas? So it's a difficult process, but the basic answer, I would say, is yes.
The first one has to do with sort of limiting factors and your sort of thesis that the Axis were overwhelmed by the quantity of production of armaments, of weapons. That seems reasonable, but it implies that there's that's the limiting factor as opposed to human resources, numbers of soldiers and so forth. Is that kind of generally true over the whole course? Is that true in 1943 as well as 44 as well as 45? And what in particular, what aspects of weaponry and so forth were really the limiting factor, say, in comparison to the numbers of soldiers or whatever they could use? And the second one has to do with Detroit. I've been feeling
hold that one so I can, before I lose the first one.
Okay.
Because, my brain isn't what it used to be.
Okay.
Yeah, it is becoming true. This is the war that makes that true simply because of the level and degree of firepower. And in particular, air power. One of the big transitions in the war is the decision of the military, who finally got it, and I'll give you an example of how they didn't get it at the start of the war in a moment, but the decision to cut back on the ground forces and increase the air forces, and not just for strategic bombing. The Air Force, remember, is still part of the Army and is trying desperately to become its own unit. But they place a lot of faith in strategic bombing, but really what was more effective, particularly after Normandy, when we're on the continent, was tactical air bombing, because we could control the air, and American planes did an immense amount of damage just from up there, and that's statistically a cheap way to kill. I hate to say that, but that's what it is, basically. So yeah, the transition is coming, and of course the ultimate of that was the atomic bomb. You know, it is true, there's no way to get around it, and I have, believe me, looked every way I could over the years how to get around it. You can't not justify dropping the bomb when you look at how many Americans would have died trying to invade Japan, given the fortress that Japan was. 500,000 casualties was the low estimate. And the high estimate went as much as 1 million. And the argument, you know, I mean, when Harry Truman wrote in his memoirs, I made the decision, and it was very courageous of him to say that. But seriously, are you going to have spent $2-3 billion to develop this weapon and say, I don't know, what do you think? What do we do with this thing? So, yeah, firepower became the multiple. And we had the numbers, don't get me wrong, but we're fighting a truly global war, both in Europe and Asia. So the firepower element of it is crucial. Now Detroit.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, I've been feeling sentimental about Detroit over the last 24 hours or so.
You're one of the few.
Yeah.
Oh, no, give that poor city
It's
some sympathy.
No personal connection, actually. But in your book, it seems to be a story of race relations more than anything else. I was just wondering, just in more detail, what was their critical role in the, you know, is it mostly sort of transportation-related things, trucks, tanks, and so forth, or is there some other aspect of things, or any aspect of the race relations thing that you want to spend a little time on right now is great. So Detroit.
Yeah, well, Detroit is, in the war, probably the most important American city. It's the home of, and this is where I think you forget, all of the stuff about manufacturing automobiles and the weaponry that associated with automobiles and trucks and tanks and so forth. That's all in Detroit. Detroit is the center of American military output. You have shipping and aircraft on the West Coast, and you have shipping in the Gulf and so forth. But Detroit is the center of it. And its problem is not just race relations, it's ethnic relations. It's the simple fact that it grew in incredible size at an incredible speed with no infrastructure to support all of those newcomers. That happened all over the country, and I've got multiple examples of it, but nowhere as much or as fast. And besides, there were plenty of white Southerners moving up too. One of my favorite lines in the book, which I don't remember who said it, but they said that there are now only 46 states in the Union because Kentucky and Tennessee are now in Michigan.
You talked about the atomic bomb, and I was wondering if you could talk about the delivery vehicle, the B-29 aircraft, its concept and design.
The gentleman wants to know if I talk a little about the concept and design of the B-29. The chapter in the book does go into that, but basically what I can tell you is that no other plane had ever been built like it. It had so many different things. It was bigger than any plane. It was aerodynamically different than any plane. It had literally its own electrical plant. In order to go the distance it was supposed to go, it had to have larger engines. And because it was going to fly as high as it did, those engines had to be turbocharged, which means one of them had to be devoted just to running all the electrics. It had, the word went out of my head, what airliners have, where you can breathe in them? Pressurized, thank you. See what happens when you get old? It had a pressurized, almost all of it was pressurized. There's a middle section that isn't. But all of that required a huge electrical system. It literally is an electrical plant in the air. It had computer-controlled guns so that the gunners, except for the tail gunner, didn't have to be next to the gun he was firing. Once they had gotten their range and all of that. Now, this was news to me, but from both the Navy and the Air Force, early primitive computerized calculations for firing of, in one case, anti-aircraft guns, and in the other, the guns in the plane, in the thing. You can go on and on with this list. The big weakness, the thing that bedeviled the B-29 forever, was its engines. Cowling fire and some other problems. The first test pilot that took one up, it was its second flight, but he was their ace at Boeing. As he was coming back in, the engines caught fire. He was over Seattle. He's trying to get out of the way. He's trying to avoid any kind of crash, but he ends up crashing into a meatpacking building. So I think something like 17 people died, including everybody in the plane. And I have a quote somewhere in the book from a pilot that says, in effect, 3-engine time was far more common on this plane than 4-engine time. That's why everybody loved the B-17, by the way. The B-17 was so reliable. That's why they called it the Queen of the Skies. Nobody ever called the B-29 that. It was just an incredible piece of machinery. And as many of them, I think, I'm exaggerating a little, but as many of them crashed as were shot down. Thank you. Thank you all.